I've been to the museum twice, and I have the app on my tablet.
Oh, good.
Even before you started prototyping, were you presented like with certain parameters you had to work in? Like we got this much space for you to work with, and were the positions of like the artifacts and things locked down, or was that still under development? Or
Yeah, I mean, all of that happens in parallel. So the museum might have, these are our artifacts, this is our space, this is our budget, this is our timeline. All of those constraints or formalities are presented. And that's part of the homework. You need to keep all of those pieces in your head. I mean, it's like any design process. But I think the key is trying to have that higher aspiration past just solving that problem to what do you want to do and what do you want to make that might be a new approach. And so for us with the pen, that was really that sort of high bar. We actually presented a range of different ideas, probably 7 ideas, the pen being the most audacious and the hardest, but the one that we ended up working with them on.
We heard a little bit about StoryCorps. Could you talk a little bit about how you became involved with them and the process of working through a government sort of funded project?
Sure. So StoryCorps is it's a not-for-profit. It's actually, and it's mostly funded through the PBS, but also the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So I got involved with them. It was kind of amazing. The founder, Dave Isay, was doing this project, and I'd done sort of collaborative storytelling projects before that. And so through a friend, I reached out, and Dave was like, hey, team's full. You sound smart and all, but I'm really busy and I can't talk to you. But then my first client was actually his mentor, this guy, Steve Zeitlin. And Steve called me and said, hey, have you heard about what Dave Isay is doing? And I said, I actually have heard about it. And he's like, I'm going to call Dave. You should work on that project. Called Dave, went and had lunch with Dave, and then Dave hired me. So there are 2 architects and a graphic designer who worked on it. But similar to that, like tons of people said, and these are very smart people from the New York Times, people from Disney, people from the public library, all of them said, similar to Tina, like this is a terrible idea. You should not ask normal people to go in a recording booth. Like, what are they going to say? And the stuff you're going to get is terrible. And what are they going to do in there? And it seemed like untenable at that moment. This is way before user-generated content, Twitter, none of this social media had happened. And so, we launched The Great Unknown and ended up having these incredible stories just emerge and pour forward.
I sit on a board of a small museum in New York, and one of the things that I personally struggle with is bringing the youth into a museum. And so today we think you bring in a lot of screens, bring in a lot of interactive entertainment, and they will come in. Do you ever run a risk of having too much of that where the actual museum gets lost from the screen that's sitting in front of them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely that's not our approach. I hope it doesn't seem like our work is bringing the screens and people will come. Like what we try and do is basically highlight what's authentic inside of those spaces. Some of those things are media-based. Like with 9/11, a lot of the core artifacts themselves are media. But I think for me, people go to museums or really anywhere in physical space because it's social, because they're connecting with other people, because they want to learn in a tangible way, and because it essentially extends our faculties and our experiences beyond ourselves. So definitely, if media is helping you do that, then that's really, really good. But I think that, Creative Mornings is a good example of how if you have an amazing idea that's generous, that is engaging, right? You don't need something that's whiz-bang. Like it's not tough to figure out how to get people into a museum, whether it's big or large, and it doesn't have to do with media specifically.
Hi, I was actually at the Cooper Hewitt a couple weeks ago for the field trips. I highly recommend. Your design is so wonderful and delightful. More of a technical question. How does the image recognition work on the table when people draw a line? Was it something that had to be manually inputted, like every single picture had to be classified in this is a curve, this is a zigzag line, or was it programmed that somehow a software could identify lines within the picture?
Yeah. So we've been doing that algorithm specifically for a couple of years. It started out being manual. So we just literally were tracing and creating the specific lines that are then found. But now we have a level that's an algorithm that's pseudo automated. So it looks through and it finds different shapes, it recommends it, and then humans basically look and corroborate, yes, this is a line that makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of technology in here, machine learning, augmented reality and all that. I wanted to ask if this technology wasn't available and you guys doesn't have access to it, how does your idea process work? Like a lot of people can just look at this and say technology is solving all your ideas, but I want to get to a little bit more core of like how you leverage ideas and use technology to combine it versus the other.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, we are a digital physical firm, right? So we have architects, we have designers, we have content people. But for us, the core approach is definitely not about technology. It's about these core human emotional ideas, the stories that we're telling. That's really what's compelling. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of technology out there. Much of it is not great, and much of it fails in relatively short order because there isn't an idea or an emotion or a story behind it. So oftentimes our clients will say to us, well, how long is this going to last, right? Like am I going to need something new in 2 years or 4 years? And our basic approach is that if you tell a good story, if you make an emotional connection, that will last, right? That's the thing that people will maintain. That's the thing that people will care about. You can see original Eames Mathematica exhibitions at, for example, the Museum of Science in Boston. And it's beautiful. It's amazing. No one, or even the work, I did work in my 20s at the Museum of Natural History, at the Hall of Biodiversity. In a surreal moment, I can bring my 9-year-old there, and he doesn't look at the work and say, you know, Daddy, these flat screens are kind of chunky, right? Like, he's just like, oh man, there's an awesome story about an ornithologist and a bird, and right? People don't go to museums to critique the hardware. People go to Times Square, and they're like, wow, that screen looks old. And the reason they do is because the screen doesn't have any content. There's no story. People don't care. They're there for the technology. But when you go to the Museum of Natural History, next to biodiversity are these old dioramas. And dioramas, you may not know, but that was literally the cutting edge screen technology of its time. It was actually stolen from Coney Island. Coney Island was doing these dioramas, all for entertainment purposes. And in a scandalous moment, a scientist said, I bet I can use that to teach kids in New York City who don't know anything about nature what Africa looks like. And in fact, there were teachers outside the Museum of Natural History protesting that they were dumbing down education by making these dioramas. Right? And so 4 generations, you have that same conversation over and over again. And they're right or wrong depending on whether or not there's a story and there's emotion there. So technology is definitely not, I hope it's not the message that you got. That's not the message. The message is make that human connection and tell those stories because that's what's going to last. Thank you so much.